Hello, today I'm going to be proving that Atlantis existed. And I'm going to be using concentric circles as a universal motif that's present all around the world as the key evidence that will prove that Atlantis exists. First of all, the city of Atlantis as described by Plato, the capital city in fact, there we can presume that there were multiple cities in Atlantis, but the capital city is described in an incredible amount of detail. And it is said that the god of Poseidon, who was the father of the city of Atlantis and a civilization, he enclosed the hill in which a um, a woman lived, a woman who was native to the civilization lived, and made alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. That's the key. That's the key phrase. That gives you a sense of what that city looks like. It's circles inside circles, concentric circles, and there were two of land and three of water. And the next passage goes into detail about exactly how wide each of those passages were, the dimensions of each, and it describes that they were all bridged together so that one could walk from the outermost ring into the innermost island, and also the fact that um, that ships could enter into the zones of water and then go into each of the and then there were passageways in which those ships could enter into the central island. But that level of detail really isn't necessarily important. What's important is that this city was made up of rings inside rings, and that it looked something like this. This is a concept art from a website. Another Atlantis researcher named Jim Allen, who believes that Atlantis is in Bolivia. I disagree with this theory, but I really like the way in which he presents his ideas, including the quality of the images on his site, so I want to give him credit for this image. This image clearly shows you the concentric circles, the structure of the city as described by Plato's dialogue. It shows that there's this central area right here, the central island that I just circled, and then it also shows that there's three rings of water, and there's two rings of land, and there's a bridge that connects the city to the sea that's beyond. And this is a perfect image that tells you exactly what you should be picturing when you think about the city of Atlantis. And the thing is, however, that this concentric circle motif that's discussed in Plato's dialogue and is actually the structure of the city, the way the city is actually designed. This kind of concentric circle design and construction is actually present all across the world. This is a stone circle named Rujum El Hiri or Gilgal Rephaim, depending on which language you're using, and this is actually a very large stone circle. It's hard to get a sense of how big this stone circle is, but if you look at the cow that's to the bottom left right here, you'll see exactly how massive this structure is. This structure could not have been built in a day. This structure took years and years to actually build, probably, and it took us and we really don't know how old this is. We know that it's thousands of years old. And so the idea is that these stone structures are kind of everywhere in this world. And so the Tartessan ceramics, this is actually a structure that was found near the city of Tartessos in actually in the city of Seville, Spain. It also shows a ceramic with a painting on it, which shows you a very, very similar structure to the concentric circle motif that's present in Plato's Atlantis. And the idea is, why is this popping up all across the world? And another example is the reach hut structure, of course. Everybody's heard of the reach hut structure. If you've kept up with the latest discoveries in the field of Atlantology, you will have heard of the reach hut structure. If you haven't, watch the very there's many good other YouTube channels that really go into the retread structure in more detail. In a future video, I'm going to be talking about the retread structure, but here all it's necessary to say is that, hey, there is this structure. We don't know if it's man-made or natural, but assuming that it was not necessarily made by man, but modified by man, taking a naturally existing structure and modifying it, that's another example of this concentric circle motif that is popping up in another place, very, very far away from the other stone circle, Gilgal Raphaim, which is in Israel, and the other one, which is in Spain. And Göbekli Tepe, I'm sure you've heard of Göbekli Tepe. If you haven't, it's a structure that was found. It's a archaeological site that was discovered in the late 90s, and it was excavated over a period of decades, in fact, I believe. And so it's one of the oldest archaeological sites ever discovered, and it's present in Turkey. It can be dated back to around 9500 to 9600 BC, or even older, as old as 12,000 years ago. And if you look at this structure, this is one of the structures. It looks very, very similar to the city of Atlantis as described by Plato, with the concentric circles, with the even with that this part sticking out. It kind of looks like the bridge that connected the waters, the sea beyond, into the city in Atlantis, and you really see a close resemblance. And it's another example of this concentric circle motif. And we know that it's not recent too, because these structures are around 11,000 years old. So the concentric circle motif isn't just something that was invented recently. This is a very, very old structural pattern that we see in sites all across the world. And this is another example of the circles, concentric circles motif, the stone circles in the Turpan Basin in the Gobi Desert. We see clearly this is much smaller than the other circles, so we can kind of, it's not perhaps as important, but it's still a stone circle, and it's still very old, and it still exists. And we can presume that this is not the only stone circle in that area, that there are many others. And so the question is, why are all of these concentric circle structural patterns evident all across the world? Is there an explanation for that? And I believe that the concentric circles motif implies the existence of a common source, a progenitor civilization in which that structural pattern was very, very important and served as a key symbol of that civilization. Whether it's a religious symbol, whether it's merely an architectural symbol, that's not something that we can really know for sure. But I believe that we really can say that even if we had never heard of the story of Atlantis, even if that original passage in which I described Plato's account of the city of Atlantis, even if we never had that, just knowing that these concentric circle structural patterns are so evident all across the world, I believe constitutes sufficient evidence to conclude that there was a common progenitor civilization. In other words, if Atlantis didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. Here's why. Look at other. I'm going to be using kind of an argument by analogy in which I talk about another kind of symbol that really is prevalent all across the world. And what is that symbol? You can guess, but I'll describe this image and I'll show you how 90% in many areas of the world, Christianity is a global religion. And we know where Christianity originated. We know that it originated in the Roman Empire, and we know that it spread out across the world over the past 2 millennia. And so, what symbol is is emblematic of Christianity? Of course, it's the cross. And we know that the cross is the symbol of Christianity. And we know that as a historical fact. It's not something that's a matter of debate. But imagine for a moment that we didn't know that. Imagine that we were in a post-apocalyptic world where we knew nothing about the past and we had lost all historical memory and records. But we noticed after a really long time of these post-apocalyptic bands wandering the earth that there were these buildings all across the world, and that they had these symbols on them, and they looked like two lines that were intersecting at perpendicular angles, with one of the lines being longer than the other. And people debated as to what that meant. It would turn out that they would be, and there was this really long running debate in which some of those post apocalyptic people believed that this symbol was independently invented all across the different continents because, because two straight lines intersecting at a right angle with one of the lines being a little bit longer than each other. That's a very lines are universal symbols, and the idea of combining two lines to form another symbol, that's something that can be independently invented across multiple cultures. Whereas another group of people would have argued in that same post-apocalyptic world that no, there had to have been a common source for this symbol for it to have spread across the entire world. There has to have been a a coherent culture in which that symbol originated and spread across the world. Well, guess what? The people who believed that the symbols originated in one central location and then spread out across the world would have been correct. Would have been correct. And I'm saying that not only in the case of the cross in Christianity, but in the case of another symbol, the swastika, which has taken on a really negative reputation due to Nazi Germany. But before Nazi Germany, it had a history that was thousands of years old, and the swastika is like this, I won't say universal symbol, but it's pretty close to being a universal symbol. It's present in cultures that are continents apart, all across the world. And so the idea is that people who study the Indo-European culture, the people who study the Indo-European studies, they acknowledge that there likely was a universal religion in the past that gave rise to this symbol, and that it has really been carried down to us and passed down to us in various forms with various variations, as you can see here. And so the idea is that the concentric circles motif is also an example of a structural pattern and a symbol that that is that was passed down, just like these religious symbols were passed down to us from a common source, and that is acknowledged by the academia. The concentric circles motif is also a symbol that's present all across the world in various forms. And so the idea, it would have been absurd, and it would have been plausible to suggest that the cross was actually independently invented because it's such a simple symbol. And it would be plausible to suggest that the concentric circles motif was independently invented because circles are a simple symbol. Anyone can seemingly take circles and put them inside circles. And it doesn't seem so absurd that people from different parts of the world could do that. But in the case of Christianity and the cross, that is wrong. In the case of the swastika and the Indo-European civilizations, that is wrong. And I'm saying, therefore, the idea that the concentric circles motif was independently invented by all of these different cultures is likely to be wrong because we have a clear counterexample in which that statement is false. In the case of Christianity and the cross, it really did come from one common source. And so, for the concentric circles motif, it's also likely to have come from a common source. But there are three alternative explanations. My explanation for this, the existence of these concentric circles, is not the only explanation. The other one is that, hey, Plato had a time machine, right? And so the question that really has to be asked is, how could Plato, we know now that there likely was a civilization of global reach that had, in which the motif of the concentric circles originated and then spread out all across the world. We now know that because of the fact that we have found these concentric circle structural patterns in so many different places around the world. The Eye of the Sahara and the Sahara Desert, Spain near Tartessos and Seville, Israel, Gilgal Rephaim, and also we found it in Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And so this is something that, and we know that these structural patterns in these stone circles are not just a few thousand years old. They date back to 4,000, 5,000, sometimes even 10,000 years ago. And so that points to an ancient civilization in which that structural pattern of the concentric circles originated. But Plato could never have known that because he lived in a time in which people were not familiar with the larger world around them. They were not familiar with the concept of, they could not have had the knowledge that these stone circles and these concentric circles were all around the world. It's not somehow a Greek symbol, right? This is not a symbol that is really prevalent in the Greek world. So Plato just happened to have invented, if you claim that Plato's Atlantis is a fictional story, he happened to invent a story about an ancient civilization with concentric circles as a central motif, when in fact such a structure, such a civilization is the very civilization that should exist given knowledge that Plato could not have even dreamt of, right? So the idea that Plato just happened to invent a story about a civilization with concentric circles as a central motif, when such a civilization is the very civilization that should be expected to exist given the prevalence of those concentric circle motifs in actual cultures across the world, is just this incredibly unlikely coincidence, right? Because Plato could have used Plato could have described the capital city of this allegedly fictional civilization in any way possible. He could have not even mentioned the structure of the fictional capital city. He could have made the capital city a square. He could have made it a triangle. He could have made it just one circle. But he specifically specified that it was composed of concentric circles. And that is precisely the motif that we see all across the world. And so that coincidence, I believe, is so unlikely that it leaves the only other remaining explanation, which is that Plato's account is true and contains genuine historical knowledge that was thousands of years old even during the Greek classical age, and that everything about Plato's account is true, and that it really reflects that this Egyptian priest that Solon spoke of and then passed the story down to Plato, that this story is true, and that the story of Atlantis is a reliable historical account from which we can learn secrets about our past.